The Great Emu War of 1932 is one of the most bizarre and amusing episodes in Australian history. It refers to a series of pest control efforts by the Australian military to manage the emu population in Western Australia. While this might sound like a humorous anecdote, the events of the war had serious agricultural and economic implications for the region. Background: the emu problem. In the early 1930s, Australian farmers in the wheat-growing regions of Western Australia were facing economic hardship due to the Great Depression. The area had been hit by drought and crop production was struggling. As if that weren't enough, a large population of emus, large flightless birds, began invading the farmland, attracted by the crops and the water sources. Emus are quite resilient, capable of running at speeds up to 50 kilometers per hour, 31 miles per hour, and having strong, sharp beaks. They are also notorious for being able to destroy crops with their large, powerful legs. By late 1932, farmers reported that emus were ruining vast fields of wheat, trampling crops, and eating the crops themselves. It was estimated that around 20,000 emus were causing significant damage to farmland in Western Australia. The government's response. In response to the farmers' complaints, the Australian government decided to intervene. The plan was to use military force to curb the emu population, an idea that seems absurd in hindsight. In November 1932, the government dispatched soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns, which were capable of firing 500 rounds per minute, to the wheat-growing areas in an attempt to eradicate the birds. The military operation was led by Major G.P.W. Meredith, who was given orders to deploy 50 soldiers to kill as many emus as possible. The soldiers were equipped with 2 Lewis machine guns, which they believed would quickly clear out the problem. The war begins. First attempts. The soldiers initially set up in the town of Campion in Western Australia, where they encountered large groups of emus. However, the operation quickly proved far more difficult than expected. The emus were fast and highly mobile, and they scattered in all directions when the soldiers attempted to get close. The birds' ability to outrun the soldiers meant that they could avoid being shot at long range. After the first attempt, only a small number of emus were killed. Estimates suggest around 50. The military had hoped for a far higher number, but the emus' speed and agility made them difficult targets. Additionally, the machine guns had trouble firing in the open, and the soldiers couldn't get into a position where they could effectively target the birds. Even worse, the guns frequently jammed, further frustrating the soldiers. Second attempt and further struggles. Undeterred, the military tried again a few days later, but this attempt was equally unsuccessful. Emu groups were hard to track, and when the soldiers would get close enough to fire, the birds would often scatter into smaller, more spread-out groups, making it difficult to shoot them all. At one point, the soldiers were able to corner a group of emus behind a fence, but again, their machine guns were ineffective, as the birds were too agile. By now, public opinion began to shift. Farmers and military officials were becoming increasingly frustrated by the lack of progress, and there was growing embarrassment over the situation. The war began to take on a comic tone as it became clear that the soldiers were unable to combat the birds effectively. Conclusion: the war ends. The military operation officially ended in December 1932, with the soldiers failing to make a significant dent in the emu population. Estimates suggest that only about 1,000 emus were killed over the course of the operation, a small fraction of the original population. Afterward, Major Meredith wrote in his report that the birds seemed to have been impervious to the machine gun fire, and that they had learned to outrun and avoid the soldiers. The emus had won the battle, and the Australian military officially declared the war